Have you ever wondered why kind people always seem to get the short end of the stick in life? Why those who try to help everyone end up getting walked all over by others? If you've ever felt this firsthand, Dostoevsky had a pretty bitter answer to this question. In one of his most profound works, the Russian writer created a character who represents everything good about human nature. But you know what happened to him? He was completely destroyed by society. The story is so cruel it will make you rethink everything about kindness and naivety. Is being a good person really a virtue? Or is there something wrong when someone is too good? Get ready for a journey that will shake your certainties about right and wrong. The question Dostoevsky poses in his work, The Idiot, is simple but devastating. Are good people really idiots? The author wasn't being cruel for fun. He was trying to solve a dilemma that had tormented him since his youth. Dostoevsky suffered from epilepsy, a disease that at the time was seen as a divine curse or a mark of madness. He knew suffering firsthand and observed how the world treated those who were different, vulnerable, or outside social norms. During his epileptic seizures, the writer experienced moments of almost mystical clarity, followed by periods of total confusion. This oscillation between lucidity and chaos profoundly shaped his vision of human nature. He understood that the line between sanity and madness is much thinner than most people imagine. His personal experiences with the disease made him question the social structures that define normality and abnormality. Epilepsy also gave him a unique perspective on vulnerability. He knew what it was like to be judged, misunderstood, and marginalized. He saw how society treated those who didn't fit perfectly into its rigid molds. This direct experience of prejudice and exclusion fed his compassion for the excluded, but also his growing bitterness toward the systematic cruelty of human nature. The book was born from the writer's personal pain, but also from a meticulous observation of 19th-century Russian society. He saw a society that systematically rewarded the clever and punished the honest. He saw good people being used, exploited, and ridiculed, while manipulators prospered and were publicly admired. This complete inversion of moral values deeply disturbed him and fed his growing disillusionment with humanity. And then arose a terrible question that wouldn't leave him in peace. Could kindness fundamentally be a form of stupidity? Could those who are too good simply not understand how the world really works in its deepest layers? Could moral naivety be a psychological deficiency that prevents a person from surviving adequately in society? Dostoevsky had brutal personal experiences that confirmed his darkest suspicions about human nature. He had been arrested for political activities considered subversive by the Tsarist regime, sentenced to death in a summary trial, and only at the last moment had his sentence commuted to forced labor in Siberia. This brutal and traumatic experience made him see up close both human cruelty and kindness in their most extreme and unfiltered forms. During his long years in the Siberian prison, he lived intimately with criminals of all types and levels of violence. Paradoxically, he found more genuine humanity and real solidarity among some of these men, completely rejected by society, than among many apparently respectable citizens he had known in his previous life. This made him deeply question traditional concepts of good and evil, of normality and social deviation. He then decided to create a risky literary experiment completely without precedent in world literature. He would place the most genuinely good man possible in the middle of a totally corrupted society and meticulously observe what would happen to him. Would this pure goodness be capable of gradually transforming the world around it through example? Or would it inevitably be destroyed by the relentless forces of selfishness and institutionalized evil? The result was one of the most disturbing and philosophically complex stories ever written about the human condition, a work that deliberately offers no easy or consoling answers, but forces the reader to confront deeply uncomfortable truths about themselves and about the society they chose to live in. But before meeting this extraordinarily good man, we need to completely understand the hostile world where he was placed to be tested. And what world was that exactly? A place dominated by unbridled greed, systematic selfishness, and avarice that contaminates and corrupts all possible human relationships. Dostoevsky wasn't inventing evil out of nothing or dramatically exaggerating to create literary impact. He was portraying with almost photographic precision the Russian society of his time. but his observations prove frighteningly applicable to any era and place in human history. In the aristocratic St. Petersburg of the idiot, money completely defines people's social value. Economic status rigidly determines who deserves respect and consideration. Superficial appearances matter infinitely more than any individual's moral essence. People habitually lie without any embarrassment, systematically manipulate without remorse, regularly betray without hesitation. It's a social world where sincerity is consistently seen as dangerous naivety and genuine kindness as exploitable weakness. In the cruel world portrayed by Dostoevsky, people constantly make morally bad choices, even knowing perfectly well that they are bad and destructive. They clearly know what is right and just, but deliberately and consciously choose the wrong anyway. Why? Because it's infinitely easier to lie than to take responsibility for one's own actions. Because it's much more advantageous to exploit others than to genuinely help. Because it's immediately more pleasurable to satisfy selfish desires than to build something lasting and truly meaningful. The author mercilessly shows how free will, that extraordinary gift that makes us fundamentally human and differentiates us from all other animals, is constantly used to destroy lives, relationships, and basic human dignity itself. It's a profoundly bitter observation. We receive the supreme gift of freedom to choose our values and actions, and we consistently choose destructively and self-destructively. The question that naturally arises is disturbing and universally applicable. Why do people seem to systematically prefer chaos to harmony? Why do they choose to lie when the truth would be objectively simpler and more liberating? Why do they deliberately opt to hurt when they could easily help? Why do they actively seek to destroy when they could constructively build? Dostoevsky doesn't offer easy or consoling answers to these fundamental questions about human nature. He doesn't believe in simplistic or comforting explanations for generalized human evil. Instead, he simply shows that this is the empirically observable reality and brutally forces the reader to face this deeply uncomfortable truth about our species. We are demonstrably capable of both great goodness and great evil. But we statistically choose the most destructive available path much more frequently. It is precisely in this morally corrupted and psychologically toxic world that the absolutely exceptional protagonist enters, Prince Lev Nikolia Mishkin. Imagine a man who spent several years completely isolated in a therapeutic sanatorium in the Swiss mountains, totally removed from Russian society and its unwritten rules, its socially accepted hypocrisies, its elaborate games of power and interpersonal manipulation. Mishkin returns to his homeland after long years treating his debilitating epilepsy and arrives in sophisticated St. Petersburg like a child emotionally lost in a world populated exclusively by adults highly experienced in systematic evil. He simply doesn't know the complex social codes that rigidly govern all meaningful human interactions. He doesn't understand or recognize the elaborate subtleties of psychological manipulation. He can't perceive when he's being deliberately and systematically deceived. More than that, Mishkin represents everything you definitely wouldn't expect to find in real life, especially in positions of power, influence, or social responsibility. He is genuinely good in an almost supernatural way, completely without pretense, strategic calculation, or hidden personal agenda. He has no hidden ulterior motives behind any of his gestures of spontaneous kindness. When he helps someone in difficulty, it's exclusively because he sincerely desires to relieve that person's concrete suffering. When he expresses affection or admiration for someone, he's speaking absolute emotional truth without mental reservations or implicit conditions. It's as if Mishkin literally hadn't learned to lie convincingly, manipulate efficiently, or adequately protect himself from others' malicious intentions. His moral purity is so extreme that it becomes almost unnatural, especially when contrasted with the generalized cynicism and systematic corruption of the aristocratic society around him. But established society simply doesn't know how to react appropriately to someone so radically different. People become profoundly and systematically suspicious, obsessively searching for the hidden motives that absolutely must exist behind so much apparently genuine goodness. Nobody is really that good, they think automatically. He certainly must be hiding some sophisticated agenda, some secret manipulation plan, some extremely refined form of psychological deception. And it's exactly here that the progressively devastating problems of the Poor Prince begin. His genuine and completely spontaneous goodness is systematically misinterpreted by practically everyone around him. Some see it as extremely sophisticated and carefully disguised cleverness. Others, even worse, interpret it as a pathological and dangerous form of idiocy that represents a potential threat to the established social order. Around Mishkin, Dostoevsky carefully and strategically placed characters who represent different specific forms and varying intensities of human moral corruption. Pufian Rajan represents obsessive passion completely without moral or rational limits. Liadev perfectly personifies daily and systematic small corruption, always discreetly scheming personal advantages. Aglia is a genuinely intelligent young woman who feels simultaneously attracted to Mishkin's extraordinary goodness and deeply irritated by his apparent social naivety. And Nastia Filipovna is a woman psychologically marked by past traumas, completely incapable of accepting or even recognizing genuine love when offered. Each carefully constructed character functions as a specific psychological mirror that precisely reflects how different fundamental personality types react when directly confronted with pure, disinterested, and unconditional goodness. And absolutely none of these reflections is particularly flattering to our species or offers substantial reasons for optimism about the basic human condition. The dynamic and progressively destructive interaction between these so radically different characters creates a true social circus, a simultaneously fascinating and deeply disturbing spectacle of manipulation, obsessive passion, systematic greed, and deliberate self-destruction. It's at an elaborate social party that one of the most symbolically revealing and dramatically powerful scenes of the entire complex narrative takes place. During this socially important party, Rogojin, completely obsessed with nostalgia and consumed by the psychological need to possess her totally, makes an absolutely shocking proposal that brutally exposes the rawest and most inhuman nature of interpersonal relationships when completely mediated by money's corrupting power. He publicly offers in front of all the guests exactly 100,000 rubles for her, treating her literally and explicitly as a valuable object available for purchase in the social market. To fully understand the psychological magnitude of this degrading proposal, it's absolutely essential to know that 100,000 rubles represented a literally gigantic fortune at the historical time portrayed. It was objectively enough money to buy a lifetime of luxury and absolute material comfort. To never again need to work out of necessity. To have access to absolutely everything money can legitimately buy. It was an amount that would completely and permanently change any ordinary person's life of that era. The socially important people present in the aristocratic room fall into total and embarrassing silence. But their minds obviously work frantically, mentally calculating with precision exactly what each one would do with so much available money. You can literally see in their eyes the material greed quickly awakening, economic desire completely overcoming any residual moral consideration about basic human dignity. But then Nastasia does something completely unexpected that simultaneously reveals both her natural intelligence and her profound mental instability. Instead of simply accepting or politely refusing the obviously degrading proposal, she physically takes all that substantial money and throws it directly and dramatically at Gaia Adelanovich, a physically attractive but morally weak young man who is present at the social party. "Here is exactly what you've always wanted in life," she says with cutting bitterness and absolute contempt. "Now prove definitively to all of us that you're not like all the others. Prove concretely that there's something genuine in you beyond pure material greed." It was simultaneously a cruel test and a revealing psychological experiment, a situation that exposed the human soul in all its moral ugliness and fundamental psychological contradiction. Ga becomes completely paralyzed, facing this psychologically impossible situation. Throughout his conscious life, he had dreamed obsessively and constantly of easy money, of the magical possibility of getting rich quickly without honest work or genuine effort. And now this material dream is literally in his physical hands, within his immediate and concrete reach. But taking that money under those specific public circumstances would mean publicly admitting in front of all those socially important people that he really is moved exclusively and fundamentally by raw material greed. It would be a public confession that he possesses no ethical principles, moral values, or personal dignity that couldn't be bought for a sufficiently high price. It's a dramatically powerful moment that exposes human nature in all its moral complexity, its fundamental internal contradictions, and its almost infinite capacity for systematic hypocrisy. God desperately wants the money but also wants to maintain his social self-image as a decent person. He painfully discovers that he can't have both desires simultaneously. It's exactly at this moment of maximum psychological tension that Mishkin makes his dramatic entrance into the complex situation. While all the others present are completely focused on the money and the material possibilities it represents, the prince offers something completely different and unexpected: sincere, unconditional, and completely disinterested love. Mishkin proposes marriage to Anastasia, not because she's physically beautiful, not because she has money or high social status, not because marriage would bring him obvious practical advantages. He genuinely wants her as a wife exclusively because he sees in her a deeply wounded person who desperately needs genuine care, understanding, and affection to heal psychologically. Anastasia's emotional reaction to this completely unexpected proposal is deeply revealing both of her specific individual psychology and of human nature in general. She is visibly touched by Mishkin's absolute emotional sincerity, clearly recognizes that he's offering exactly what she most needs and desperately desires deep in her wounded soul. But then she does something that tragically demonstrates how severe psychological trauma can make people completely incapable of accepting precisely what they most need to heal emotionally. She simply can't accept the genuine love offered by Mishkin. Why? Because she doesn't fundamentally believe deep in her psychologically hurt soul that she deserves to be genuinely loved by any decent person. So, she deliberately chooses to run away with Rogoyin, consciously opting for destructive and potentially violent passion instead of quiet and potentially healing love. This apparently irrational choice shows precisely how Mishkin's goodness works in the real world. He can identify exactly what people need to be truly happy, but they often can't accept this help when offered. It's as if Mishkin's extraordinary moral purity exposed so clearly the corruption and psychological problems of others that they felt deeply uncomfortable with themselves when they were in his physical presence. Instead of using this uncomfortable exposure as a valuable opportunity for personal change and moral growth, they consistently prefer to distance themselves from the source of psychological discomfort. And it's precisely here that we begin to systematically observe how Mishkin's extraordinary goodness gradually becomes the direct and inevitable cause of his own complete personal ruin. When he inherits a substantial fortune through family circumstances, distant relatives who had never shown any genuine interest in him suddenly discover his existence and his new material wealth. One by one, they begin strategically appearing in his life with elaborately constructed stories and urgent requests for substantial financial help. A distant cousin he barely knows personally desperately needs money to save the family's ancestral farm from supposedly imminent foreclosure. An aunt, who had never sought him out before in life, suddenly appears with urgent debts that allegedly must be paid immediately to avoid severe legal consequences. Distant acquaintances miraculously remember his existence when they need substantial loans for supposedly guaranteed investments that promise exceptional returns. And Mishkin, absolutely faithful to his nature, generously helps all of them without asking inconvenient questions, without demanding guarantees or proof, without establishing clear deadlines for payment. For Mishkin, the inherited money only has real value if it can be used to concretely alleviate observable human suffering. He genuinely can't see logical sense in accumulating material wealth while people around him claim to be going through financial difficulties that he has the immediate power to easily resolve. The few honest people around Mishkin are genuinely shocked observing the systematic process of exploitation. He's going to lose absolutely everything, they say with growing concern. These people are clearly shamelessly taking advantage of his goodwill. But Mishkin simply can't psychologically say no to requests for help, even when his reason clearly tells him he's being systematically exploited. His fundamental psychological inability to establish and maintain healthy boundaries becomes a fatal weakness that all opportunists quickly identify and methodically exploit. He becomes an absolutely irresistible target for anyone minimally willing to invent a convincing story of genuine financial need. Aglia observes this entire painful process with a growing mixture of admiration and despair that consumes her internally. She falls deeply in love with Mishkin, precisely because of this extraordinary goodness that makes him completely unique among all the men she has known in her life. But simultaneously, she feels increasingly frustrated with his apparent inability to learn from repeated experience and adequately protect himself from obvious malicious intentions. She desperately wants to protect him from the cruel world, but also ardently desires that he develop the practical wisdom and emotional intelligence necessary to protect himself sustainably. This psychological tension creates a complex emotional dynamic that leaves her constantly divided between deep love and growing irritation. The relationship that develops between Aglia and Mishkin becomes an absolutely fascinating psychological study of how different people react to extreme goodness when they encounter it in real life. She loves him precisely for the moral qualities that also deeply frustrate her. She admires him exactly for the behaviors that also embarrass her when publicly observed. It's as if Mishkin's extraordinary moral purity made Aglia feel morally inferior by comparison. An uncomfortable psychological sensation that she doesn't know how to adequately process. She wants to grow morally to be at his spiritual level, but also wants him to develop sufficient practical intelligence to descend to her level. This emotional and moral tension creates a psychologically complex love triangle where Mishkin finds himself dramatically divided between two women who represent completely different and mutually exclusive life paths. On one side is Aglia, who represents possible, sensible, and potentially lasting love, based on realistic mutual compatibility and pragmatic understanding of normal human limitations. On the other side is Nastasia, who represents impossible, tragic, and inevitably self-destructive love, based exclusively on heroic compassion and the noble, but probably futile desire to save someone who perhaps simply cannot be saved by normal human means. The choice that Mishkin eventually makes between these two very different women reveals something absolutely crucial about his fundamental personality and his deepest moral values. He doesn't choose based on what would be objectively better for his own personal happiness and long-term psychological well-being. Instead, he chooses based exclusively and consistently on who he perceives needs his help and emotional protection most urgently. And Nastasia, with all her severe emotional instability and her clearly self-destructive tendencies, obviously needs much more help than Aglia, who is young, genuinely intelligent, emotionally balanced, and has the constant support of a loving and structured family. This choice reveals that Mishkin systematically and consistently prioritizes others' perceived needs over his own, even when this means consciously choosing guaranteed suffering instead of possible happiness. This crucial and irreversible decision leads to the most dramatically intense moment of the entire complex story. Nastasia, after long psychological hesitation and severe internal conflict, finally accepts to officially marry Mishkin. The wedding is formally scheduled, guests are properly invited. All social and legal preparations are carefully made. Everything seems to be finally heading toward a happy ending, a positive and redemptive resolution to the prolonged sufferings of both. But Dostoevsky, absolutely faithful to his profoundly pessimistic vision of fundamental human nature, doesn't believe in easily conquered happy endings or simple solutions to genuinely complex psychological problems. On the very wedding day, with Nastasia appropriately dressed as a bride and walking solemnly toward the altar where Mishkin waits patiently with genuine love and renewed hope, she suddenly sees Rogojan in the crowd of expectant guests. And then something happens that absolutely nobody expected, not even herself. She abandons Mishkin literally at the altar and impulsively runs away with her dangerously obsessive admirer. Why does she do something so apparently cruel and psychologically irrational at the last possible moment? The explanation is psychologically complex and reveals much about how severe emotional trauma can permanently distort a person's capacity for emotionally healthy and constructive relationships. Deep in her psychologically wounded soul, Nastasia simply doesn't believe she fundamentally deserves the extraordinary goodness that Mishkin is genuinely offering. She sees herself basically as a morally corrupted person, permanently stained by past physical and emotional abuse, completely unworthy of pure and disinterested love. In her mind, systematically distorted by trauma, accepting Mishkin's love would inevitably contaminate his moral purity with her own psychological problems and perceived flaws. Rogin represents something psychologically different and paradoxically more emotionally comfortable for her. He is obsessive, possessive, and potentially dangerous. But this destructive passion makes more emotional sense to her than the quiet and potentially healing love constantly offered by Mishkin. It's as if Anastasia felt deeply in her wounded and conditioned psychology that she fundamentally deserves to be mistreated and possessed as an object instead of loved and respected as a person. Severe trauma had psychologically conditioned her to accept destructive relationships as normal and expected, and to automatically reject healthy relationships as impossible or dangerous. What follows is an announced psychological tragedy that develops with the mathematical inevitability of an avalanche. Regulian, completely consumed by sick jealousy and possessive obsession, can't psychologically accept that Nastasia continues thinking emotionally about Mishkin, even while being physically with him. Regian's obsessive passion gradually transforms into something genuinely monstrous and completely uncontrollable. A destructive force that progressively consumes his own capacity to reason logically or feel basic human empathy. On a fateful night, moved by a rage and jealousy that he himself can't understand or completely control, he commits the final and irreversible act. He kills the woman he claimed to love more than life itself. But here we reach the most psychologically shocking and philosophically significant moment of the entire complex narrative. When Mishkin discovers the terrible crime, his emotional reaction is not of hatred, revenge, or natural desire for justice. There is no understandable anger, no thirst for appropriate punishment, no moral satisfaction from seeing the guilty party suffering the consequences. Instead of denouncing Rigogin to the competent authorities or abandoning him to his legally deserved fate, Mishkin does something that borders on the psychologically incomprehensible for the common mentality. He genuinely consoles the murderer. He sees in Rogozin not a monster who deserves severe punishment, but a person who was completely destroyed by his own misdirected and inadequately controlled love. Mishkin spends the entire night beside Nastasia's body and Rigogin, who is in a state of total psychological shock. He literally holds the hand of the man who murdered the woman he himself loved deeply and genuinely. It's an act of compassion so extreme that it completely transcends normal understanding of expected human emotions and reactions. This scene simultaneously represents the absolute peak of Mishkin's extraordinary goodness and the precise moment of his final and irreversible psychological destruction. He managed to maintain his moral purity and his infinite compassion until the end. But the price of this maintenance was literally his own mental sanity. The devastating emotional shock of the tragedy, systematically combined with years of accumulated constant disappointments and systematic exploitation by people he should have been able to trust, finally breaks his psychologically fragile mind definitively and irreversibly. The mental structure that allowed him to function in the world, even inadequately, simply collapses completely under the accumulated weight of emotional pain. The story's ending is devastatingly cruel and realistically bitter. Mishkin suffers a severe relapse of his mental illness and needs to be permanently hospitalized again in the Swiss sanatorium he had left full of hope at the beginning of the narrative. He loses absolutely everything. The money was completely wasted on people who systematically exploited him. Friends distanced themselves when he most needed emotional support. His sanity was definitively shattered by the experience. The society he tried heroically to help and improve with his goodness definitively expels him as a broken object that no longer serves absolutely any purpose. He literally becomes an idiot in the precise medical sense of the word, completely unable to function independently in the social world. Dostoevsky deliberately offers no easy consolation or comforting moral lesson to soften this brutally realistic conclusion. There is no hopeful final redemption, no satisfying poetic justice, no consoling suggestion that Mishkin's suffering served some greater or higher purpose. Mishkin is systematically destroyed precisely for being too good for the fundamentally corrupted world in which he tried to live and function. His extraordinary goodness, which should theoretically be his greatest virtue and moral strength, in practice becomes the direct and inevitable cause of his complete personal ruin. The author was making a profoundly bitter and realistic observation about the fundamental nature of human societies. Pure goodness is simply incompatible with life in society as it really exists and functions. Being too good is not an admirable and sustainable virtue, but a specific form of psychological deficiency that prevents a person from functioning adequately in the real world. The specific lesson that emerges from the story is hard and psychologically difficult to accept. Extreme goodness not balanced by other practical qualities can literally destroy a person. Mishkin is excessively generous, too trusting, forgives too easily. He can't impose necessary limits, can't defend himself when systematically attacked, can't effectively learn from repeated mistakes. For all these fundamental reasons, he is constantly exploited, disrespected, and finally destroyed by people who are objectively inferior to him in moral terms, but decisively superior in terms of practical intelligence and basic self-preservation instinct. Modern society, more than a century after Dostoevsky, has empirically confirmed many of his pessimistic observations about human nature and destructive social dynamics. The popular expression, "nice guys finish last," perfectly summarizes the fundamental dilemma faced by Prince Mishkin and similar people. People who are excessively kind, too available, too good, are systematically seen as weak, naive, or manipulative by others. Their extreme goodness doesn't inspire admiration or lasting gratitude, but systematic distrust and eventually social contempt. This doesn't necessarily mean that goodness itself is a bad or socially undesirable human quality. It means, however, that goodness unaccompanied by practical intelligence, firmness when necessary, and the ability to establish and maintain healthy boundaries inevitably becomes a sophisticated form of personal self-sabotage. But was Dostoevsky completely right in his pessimistic conclusions? Modern critics and philosophers have raised several interesting objections to his analysis of goodness and its practical limits in social life. Some argue that Mishkin fails not for being too good per se, but for being too passive in his goodness. Active and strategically engaged goodness, which works systematically to identify and change unjust situations, is fundamentally different from passive goodness that simply accepts everything and everyone without adequate critical discrimination. Others suggest that the central problem is not Mishkin's extraordinary goodness, but his apparent lack of emotional intelligence and necessary basic social skills. He consistently fails to adequately read people's motivations and intentions around him. He can't recognize obvious manipulation when it happens systematically. He doesn't develop the essential ability to perceive when he's being deliberately deceived. Goodness combined with high emotional intelligence and sophisticated social skills could, these critics argue, have produced dramatically different results. The problem is not fundamentally being good, but being good without developing the complementary capabilities that make goodness effective and sustainable, instead of self-destructive. Perhaps the true lasting lesson is not that good people are inevitably idiots, but that goodness needs to be intelligent, strategic, and balanced to be genuinely effective in the real world. We need to be kind when the situation appropriately requires kindness, but also firm and even tough when the situation clearly requires firmness. Mishkin's story functions as a specific warning. Goodness without practical wisdom is dangerous. Compassion without healthy boundaries is self-destructive. Generosity without adequate discernment inevitably invites systematic exploitation. But it also functions as an important reminder. Genuinely good people are extraordinarily rare and precious. The work remains profoundly current because these fundamental moral dilemmas persist in our era. We still face the central question of how to be a genuinely decent person in a world that doesn't always adequately reward decency. We still struggle to find the right balance between goodness and practicality, between compassion and necessary self-preservation. The answer is not to completely abandon goodness or become cynical and selfish. The answer is to learn to be good in a more intelligent, strategic, and sustainable way. It's to maintain goodness as a central and defining value, but also develop the other qualities and capabilities that make this goodness effective and lasting, instead of self-destructive. Mishkin teaches us through his heroic and tragic failure that goodness alone is not sufficient to adequately navigate the complexities of modern social life. We also need practical wisdom to know when and how to be effectively kind. We need moral courage to defend our values when they are attacked. We need emotional intelligence to navigate the complexities of human relationships. Most importantly, we need to learn to protect ourselves adequately so we can continue being genuinely good people in the long term. A person who is completely destroyed by their own goodness can't effectively help anyone. It's objectively better to be strategically good and lastingly effective than to be purely good and completely ruined. Prince Mishkin's tragic story ends in destruction and madness. But our own story doesn't necessarily have to end in the same devastating way. We can learn from his fundamental mistakes without abandoning his admirable moral values. We can be kind without being naive, generous without being foolish, compassionate without being self-destructive. This is the true lasting lesson of the idiot. It's not a story about stopping being good, but about learning to be good in a way that actually works and endures in the real world. Dostoevsky clearly shows us what we shouldn't do. It's up to each of us to discover and consistently implement what we should do. If this video made you rethink your ideas about goodness, naivety, and the complexities of modern moral life, you're certainly not alone in this important reflection. These questions have tormented thinkers, philosophers, and ordinary people for many centuries, and they continue to be profoundly relevant and urgent in our time. Subscribe to the channel if you want to continue exploring these profound and complex questions about human nature, morality, and the practical challenges of living a decent life in an imperfect world. Leave your like if the video shook your certainties and made you think differently about goodness and wisdom. And in the comments, tell us about your own experience. Have you ever felt like Prince Mishkin? Have you ever been too good for your own good? How do you balance goodness with practical wisdom in your daily life?